In this short presentation, we will explore some tools for responding to an outbreak event where the origins and mode of transmission are either unknown or unconfirmed. You can find a longer description of these tools and related practices in the chapter on public health preparedness in UNDESA's Handbook on Managing Infrastructure Assets for Sustainable Development. Even the best preparedness planning cannot account for all the possible modes of transmission and spread that are connected with outbreak and larger epidemic events. This is especially the case when public health emergencies are caused by natural or man-made disasters. The likelihood and consequences of different viral and bacterial outbreaks can be extremely high after a natural disaster or industrial catastrophe that causes human injuries, fatalities, or damages housing and critical infrastructure like hospitals and clinics. When the possible modes of transmission and community spread are unknown or unconfirmed, asset managers can support the public health response based on their knowledge of the local context and how local systems operate. Many decisions will need to be made under high levels of uncertainty. Local and national authorities must work together to make consequential choices using incomplete, imprecise, and dynamic information. Typically, public health officials will want to conduct a rapid risk assessment to think through disease control options. There are different types of assessments which are used to characterize the risks to populations within a locality during an outbreak event with unknown or unconfirmed origins and transmission dynamics. Hazard and exposure assessments are often led by and carried out with teams of public health experts. Context assessments are where the asset management team can contribute. Core members of the local asset management team are more likely to be involved with context assessment. Here we see 4 basic questions that asset managers can ask as part of the context assessment. First, what factors associated with local assets under government control increase vulnerability in local populations? Second, are there local assets that can be used to help identify suspected cases? Third, do any factors associated with local assets under government control reduce the local population's risk of exposure? Finally, what is the availability and accessibility of government assets to support effective prevention measures and other non-pharmaceutical interventions? The sudden presence of a major disease outbreak will inevitably raise expectations that critical local assets, those infrastructure most important to the delivery of the government's objectives, perform at the highest level. This might mean identifying operations and maintenance to accommodate unforeseen and rapid changes in the level of demand. Some of these choices will necessarily be reactive, but as you can see in the figure on the screen, local assets and other infrastructure provide valuable services to preventing the spread of transmissible diseases during the initial stages of an outbreak. When faced with an outbreak of unknown or unconfirmed origins or transmission channels, asset managers that do not have an emergency operation plan can still rely on tools like an Emergency Response Asset Management Action Plan, or what we call an ERA map. Here we will cover a simplified prioritization approach you can adopt to think through your options, which option should be implemented first, and how to be confident in your decision-making process even in times of uncertainty. It is important to remember that you should always consult with public health officials to combine relevant information and findings from the rapid disease risk assessment with the specialized knowledge of local asset managers. To help determine where you allocate your resources, we will combine 2 factors: the likelihood that a specific asset response will prevent further spread and its broad consequences. Here we see responses for our 2 factors. It is important to balance the consideration of how likely the response will prevent further spread with the consideration of the consequences of implementing the asset response measure. We want to consider the consequences along 4 dimensions: social, ethical, economic, and political. Again, we want to emphasize the importance of working with public health officials to understand the epidemiological characteristics and implications of certain asset responses. However, asset management is too important to be left only to public health officials. We should also listen to and consider the arguments of stakeholders that focus on economic, social, ethical, and political factors to ensure we achieve wide-scale public compliance and safety with the response measures we choose. Now, having laid out the assessment criteria, we can begin to examine options. The list on the screen covers a wide variety of non-pharmaceutical interventions that could be response options to an outbreak of unknown or unconfirmed origins or transmission dynamics if the scale of the outbreak reaches public health emergency levels. Have a look. All of these options merit consideration, but we may not have enough resources to implement them all. In that instance, we will have to choose which ones to implement first or which ones not to implement at all. We can plot our set of options within a risk-response matrix. Those options that have a likely to almost certain impact on controlling the spread of infections or illness, and which also have minimal or minor negative consequences, would fall into the bottom left corner. These options we should try to roll out first. At the opposite end, in the upper right corners, we might have a set of options which are highly unlikely to have an impact and have the potential of major and severe negative consequences. Those options we would want to initially avoid and perhaps never implement. Other options might fall somewhere in the middle, for which we will have to give special consideration, balancing the negative consequences of implementing control measures with the likelihood of measure to prevent the further spread. Asset management action plans can be adapted to organize, implement, and monitor the asset response to a major emergency, such as a disease outbreak. A more streamlined version fit for the purposes of fast response under emergency conditions is the Emergency Response Asset Management Action Plan, or what we call an ERA-MAP. You can find details about how to develop an ERA-MAP in UNDESA's Handbook on Managing Infrastructure Assets for Sustainable Development.